Okay, so welcome to Thinkville. It's good to have you both on, Professor Beall, who we've had on before, and Professor Huemer. So I guess to start it off, Professor Beall here is a glut theorist who thinks that, glut theory is going to be able to account for semantic paradoxes maybe more in a better way than classical is able to. Um, and conversely, Huemer thinks that, maybe classical is able to fend off these objections and preserve our, regular set of uh, inference rules that we take in ordinary reasoning. Um, I guess just the first question I'd have is for Beall. Um, what do you think the classical logician is going to struggle with, you know, um, handling when trying to preserve classical?
Well, take a step back from the question of paradoxes themselves and just ask, why do so-called classical logicians think that classical logic, which is, a modern invention, is actually the right account of logical validity? There are a lot of entailment relations, validity relations, consequence relations, standardly understood on the language we speak. One of them is logical validity or logical consequence. It's the one that governs the sparse logical vocabulary. And so-called classical logicians think that what we call classical logic, which is classical first-order logic, with or without identity. I mean, there's always been controversy about whether classical first-order identity is actually logical vocabulary. So let's ignore that. And think of the standard first order vocabulary without identity as logical vocabulary. Why do so-called classical logicians think that classical first order logic is the right account of logical validity? If it is, then it's the account that is in place universally in all true theories, in all consequence relations, closing all true theories. And I've never seen a reason to think as much. When classical first order logic was formulated, it was formulated to describe the entailment behavior of logical vocabulary in true classical mathematical theories. I think it does that. I think it does it perfectly. But it's a pretty surprising inference to think that because the logical vocabulary behaves that way in true mathematical theories, then it behaves that way across all true theories, regardless of the phenomenon being truly described. So I think one question is, why do people like Professor Huemer? I looked at his book Paradoxes, and so I mean, he may have answered this elsewhere. Yeah. And he's up front, that he just endorses classical logic, and then he tries to make sense of various paradoxes, semantic and otherwise, within that framework. It's an interesting, good project. I just don't know why you would think that classical logic gives the right account of logical validity to begin with. I do think that true mathematical theories, and this is contrary to other glut theorists like Zach Weber, Graham Priest, Chris Mortensen, and some others, I do think that true mathematical theories are classically closed. So any paradoxes arising within those, we have to make sense within classical boundaries. We have to make sense of them. But I mean, reality is much bigger than mathematics. So when you ask yourself, well, why think that these logical bounds exhaust the boundaries? I've just never seen a good reason to. And because we lose nothing by going to, like an FDE setting where you just, it's subclassical, it's just slightly weaker than classical, gives up, exhaustion and exclusion behavior of negation and disjunction and stuff. You don't lose any true theories. And you gain viable candidates for true theories of various phenomena. So to me, I think you should go with that sort of account of logic. We can then ask, once we settle on the logical bounds, then we can ask, well, how do we give the true account of this paradoxical phenomenon or this normal phenomenon, the speed of light, or what have you? But I think, before, I don't look at it as, oh, the classical logician can't do this or can't do that. I mean, maybe in my younger day when I was overly enthusiastic or something, I may have, but I don't really see that, in light of a sort of more mature reflection. I'm not looking at it that way. I'm looking at it as, I don't know why classical logicians think that account, that very new account of consequence, is the right account of logical validity. And that's a critical question because it does constrain a lot, because it's thereby the universal one. If logical validity is weaker than classical, you have more options, but you can certainly close your true theories classically. As I said, I think mathematics is. But I've rambled a bit on your question. I'm not sure if I've muddied things or helped. So I'll stop.
So yeah, I think you gave a good answer. So what you're really calling into question, I guess, is, why do classical logicians kind of want to take the, all our classical rules and like it was given to us as the 11th commandment, like, I guess I'll turn that over to Huemer, what he thinks about that.
Oh, well, so I have a few slides about the Lyre paradox. Can I give them? Let's do it. Well, I'm going to see whether I actually can literally give them. There's something that says present at the bottom. Oh, share screen. Maybe this will work. Okay, wait. So I got to figure out how to do this. Okay. Did that work? Or yeah. Okay, good. Anyway, don't worry, it's short. I only have a few. Anyway, okay. I was just going to say what the Lyre paradox is. So here's a sentence. I call this sentence L. This sentence is false. Okay, that's an interesting sentence. We might wonder, is that true or false? Okay, here's an argument about that, about its truth value. So premise, if a sentence says that A is F, then it's true if and only if A is F. Seems right? Okay, so that seems to be just sort of like true in virtue of the meaning of true. Second, L says that L is false, which you can tell just by inspecting it. It looks like it says that it's false. So conclusion, L is true if and only if L is false. So that follows from 1 and 2. All right, okay, very simple argument. And the problem is, 3 is a contradiction in classical logic. I'm assuming that false means not true. And by the way, there's no point in disputing that, because if you dispute that, I could just change a sentence to say this sentence is not true. So, okay. So anyway, there's a problem. Okay, and then this is my proposed solution. So I denied 2, that L says that L is false. And instead, I think L fails to express a proposition. And so as a result, it doesn't have a truth value. So compare it to a sentence like I say, he has gone out, when I haven't specified whom I'm talking about. And you ask me, hey, who has gone out? And I go, I don't know. I just didn't really have anyone in mind. Then is it true or false? Right. And you're supposed to think, well, it's neither true nor false, because I didn't specify a complete proposition, right? Because I don't have in mind a particular subject. Okay. Why might L fail to express a proposition? So this was my idea. Meanings of sentences are determined by conventional rules, perhaps implicit. They might not actually have been stated, but perhaps implicit rules for interpreting sentences. And if the rules for interpreting sentences are inconsistent, then they would fail to pick out a meaning for particular sentences. If they fail to pick out a meaning, then there is no proposition expressed by the sentence. There's not something else other than the conventions that's going to pick out what proposition a sentence expresses. Okay, and my claim is the rules of English are inconsistent when applied to this particular sentence. They're fine for most sentences, but you just get an inconsistency in how you're supposed to interpret this particular sentence. And to make that explicit, well, the sentence L is supposed to express a proposition, but it's also supposed to express the proposition that that very proposition is false. But there's no proposition that's identical to the proposition that it itself is false. So there's no way of consistently following the instructions for interpreting this sentence. Okay, let's see. And then, other things you might think about.
For some reason, the stream you're sharing is stuck on the title slide of the slideshow.
What? So you haven't seen any of my slides?
No.
Why is that? I don't know what's happening. That's annoying. Okay. Tell me if anything changes.
Mm-hmm.
How about that?
Yeah, that worked.
Well, okay. Wait, if I do this, will that work?
Yeah, that's changing them, yeah.
Okay, anyway. All right, anyway, okay, well, that was the argument that I was talking about. Is that. Okay, anyway. Okay, further things that you might wonder about. Okay, wait. Other implications. So these are other things that fail to express propositions. Like, what if somebody says this sentence is true? Okay, that also fails to express a proposition. In that case, the problem isn't really that it's inconsistent. It's that there's too many propositions that are equivalent to the proposition that proposition is true. Somebody says this sentence is false or fails to express a proposition. So this is intended to bring back the paradox, but no, that also just fails to express a proposition. Or, this pair of sentences, the following sentence is true, the preceding sentence is false. Okay, so that pair fails to express a proposition. All right, so none of those have truth values. They're neither true nor false. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have. Anyway, so that was my view about the liar paradox.
Okay, so I know you also take a similar approach to most semantic paradoxes. I guess you could call it a propositionalist account. So I saw on the slides you also had the image that you put in your book of the two, not A and A.
Yeah.
And that was kind of your motivation for thinking the law of non-contradiction, or thinking that contradictions can't be true, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Sorry, let me just put this back.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, okay. No, like, this is classical negation. So the rectangle is supposed to represent something like all the possible worlds or all the possible situations. And then like the left rectangle is the situations in which A is true, and then the right hand one is the situations in which not A is true. And there's no overlap, and also they cover the entire area. Okay. And my claim is, well, like as far as I understand it, that's just like the meaning of not. Okay, now suppose that you think that I'm wrong about that. Like I'm confused about what not means. And so suppose you think, no, actually there is some overlap between A and not A. Like there's some situations in which they're both true. And then maybe there's also some situations in which neither of them is true. Okay, so suppose I'm just confused about what not means in English. Well, I could just stipulate a new connective, which I call not exclamation mark. And I'm just going to stipulate that, even if not A actually overlaps with A, not exclamation mark A is going to exclude this region. Okay. And even if there's something that's not included by either A or not exclamation mark is by definition going to include that region. So, okay. And then you can see that you could just regenerate the liar paradox with the not exclamation mark. And so, no point in arguing with me about what not means in English, unless you think that what I just said didn't actually, you didn't actually understand the not exclamation mark connective. Like if you think that didn't make sense, right? But if that makes sense, then there's no point in arguing about whether the English word actually means that. So.
Okay, so I guess I'll just ask Professor Beall what his thoughts are more generally on the stuff you presented.
Well, as I said, I mean, Professor Huemer starts with a commitment to what we call the classical account of logic, which is a very modern sort of thing, and I would be interested in hearing whether he has good reason to do so. So bracketing that out, let me not comment on the liar as it stands. I mean, there are a bunch of questions about that account. If we're just talking about sort of something to say to other people, I get the idea. But if we're talking about a sort of, formal account that applies to theories, would-be true theories, I don't understand exactly how it works. You have to ask, is the sentence, call it a prop, okay, is the sentence in the language of the theory? And if so, is it in the range of the theory's closure relation, the consequence relation, validity relation, whatever you want to say? If so, I mean, you can't draw these in any clear way. You can't draw these distinctions between one, call it token of a sentence, and another. I mean, there have been a lot of attempts to do that. I've never seen one that has really worked. So put that aside. I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about that account as far as it goes. I mean, it has similarities to the contextualists, but I didn't, that's again, there are a lot of details there. But let's just talk about the argument with the meaning of not in English. Well, first, of course, there are many uses of the word not in English. Presumably, we're talking about what we call logical negation. Logical negation is logic's falsity operator. It is false that. We represent it in various ways as a unary connective in the standard language of first order logic. But that's what it is. It is false that. It's dual of the truth operator that logic has. It is true that we never list the truth operator in the logical syntax because it's entirely redundant given its semantics. But you have a truth operator, you have a falsity operator. So if that's what we're talking about, what are the truth and falsity conditions for, what are the classical truth and falsity conditions for logical negation? Well, logical negation is true in a model if and only if the negatum is false in the model. Logical negation is false in a model if and only if the logical negation is false in the model if and only if the negatum is true in the model, or negand, whatever you want for the thing being logically negated. Okay, I completely endorse those. If you roll out some of the spaces in Professor Huemer's diagram, the overlap space and the sort of out in the middle of nowhere, the gappy space, you roll those out, then you can prove that given those truth and falsity conditions for logical negation, you can do away with falsity. That's a result about the classical account. But we started this by asking, is there a reason to rule those spaces out? Professor Huemer says it's the meaning of not, but I'm not sure how we get there. I think that there are many true theories that roll out the glutty space and the gappy space. Absolutely no question about it. In fact, I think many true theories roll those out. But that doesn't mean that all true theories do. And I'm still waiting for some reason to think that the very meaning of logical negation rolls them out. I haven't seen one.
Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, I had a couple of questions. Like, you said a couple of times that classical logic was a new invention. Could you say more
Well,
about
I
that?
mean, it was what the 1900s with Whitehead, Russell, Frege. I mean, that's when it was formulated.
I was thinking it goes back to Aristotle.
No, Aristotle's logic, according to historians, it has a lot of principles. I mean, he has a gazillion arguments for the law of non-contradiction, but most of them are fallacious by his own lights, and most of them won't give you what you want as far as a law of non-contradiction.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Well, for example, presumably what you want from the law of non-contradiction is the logical validity of A, not A, to B, whether the A and not A are conjoined or separate, whatever. A, not A, where not here is logical negation. So it's true that A, it's false that A, taken together, logically entail arbitrary B. That's what you want from a law of non-contradiction.
I'm not sure if we want that.
Well, if you want the logical validity of logical negation, parentheses, A conjunction, logical negation A, I mean, that's completely compatible with there being gluts, of course. That can be valid, but be both true and false in some possibilities. Too bad we don't have a whiteboard here, because it'd be easier to write this stuff.
Yeah, it would. So I mean, so there's the law of non-contradiction. So contradictions are always false, and there's a law of exclude middle. So every proposition is either the case or its negation is the case.
But sorry, when you say contradictions are always false,
they're also not true.
No, I mean, I certainly take it. So if but and by contradiction, we just mean that formally, right? We just mean the logical conjunction of a sentence and its logical negation. Let these be, you can call all the sentences we're talking about propositions or whatever. I don't care, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about a contradiction, right?
Like A and not A. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, but I mean, I view the principle of explosion as a distinct claim about, like about what validity is, right? Or so, what's a valid?
Okay, so I don't mean to cut you off, but I mean, I just want to make sure we're not talking past each other. So, so I don't know. How does this, let's see, does this show up the right? Probably shows up backwards, right? Does that show up correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you taking, so let this be logical validity, which means anything valid according to this is valid in every true theory. So, oops, sorry, I messed that up. So where the turnstile, just unmarked turnstile's logical validity, you're taking that to be a statement of non-contradiction. So this basically says it's logically valid that it's false that A and it's false. So it's false that it's true that A and it's false that A. And that's for all A in the language.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I reject that because I think that there are gaps. But let's just ignore the gappy space. Okay. I mean, that's perfectly fine. That can be valid, and you can have cases where let A be a glut. Then on the classical truth and falsity conditions for conjunction, which is conjunctions true if and only if both conjuncts are, conjunctions false if and only if at least one's false. If A is a glut, then it's true and false. Hence, both it's by the classical truth and falsity conditions for negation, its negation is true and false. So both conjuncts are true, both conjuncts are false. So at least one is false. So the conjunction is true and false. So the negation is true and false. So validity just looks at, is this thing true in every possibility? So that can be logically valid, but there can still be gluts. That alone doesn't rule it out. That's why I said what you want is so letting the turnstile still be.
Well, what I want is there aren't any gluts.
That's what you want for your principle of non-contradiction.
Well,
that's compatible. The classical logician acknowledges or can, I mean, maybe not for some reason, but can certainly acknowledge the trivial model where every sentence in the language is true. But this would tell you that there's exactly, if this is logical validity and this is true, then every logical possibility in which there's a glut is the trivial one. So there's exactly one trivial one, there's exactly one glutty possibility according to the classical story. I mean, you can ignore that and just say there is none. But a sort of smoother picture for the classical person is to say, well, okay, there are gluts, but it's complete triviality. It's just the one and only trivial possibility, and we know that's not the actual truth. But in any event, so I like just to say, well, there's, every contradiction is false. That alone, can mean a gazillion different things. So that's why I just wanted to pause a minute and make sure we're talking about. So when you talk about the law of non-contradiction, you should be talking about
Okay, but no, I mean that thing doesn't rule out the possibility that there are true contradictions and everything's true.
Correct.
But like the law of non-contradiction should rule that out.
Okay,
So,
but I don't know. So you'd have to specify the law in such a way that you have that ruled out. You can use theoretical vocabulary, but we're talking about sparse logical vocabulary.
yeah, I mean, well, I'm not sure that I have to specify using, formal symbols. Okay,
Well,
so
no, of course not. This is abbreviation. It gets cumbersome to say in English when we are not sure what we're talking about.
yeah.
That's why I wanted to zero in on the right sort of principle. You're saying that this principle is insufficient. So then we need to know what the principle is that you're saying.
Yeah, there aren't any true contradictions. There aren't any truth value gluts. Right. I mean, you might say, oh, but that could be true, but there could also be truth value gluts. But
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, obviously, any sentence logically could be glutty, just like any sentence in the language of true physics could be, could be false. Just it's not false of this world. But I guess this takes us right back to why I think that as I said, a very new account of logical validity is the right account of logical validity versus what it was intended as by the mathematicians who drew it up. Why not think that it is the right account of the logical vocabulary in true mathematical theories? I think that's absolutely correct. And to get the classical account, you just, in the theory's consequence relation, you just close out the glutty and gappy spaces. And I have a lot of work spelling out how exactly that happens in true theories. But some of that's more detailed than we probably want to get.
yeah, maybe you could say more about what you mean about the classical account of validity. So on the face of it, I wasn't thinking that it was a dispute about validity. I mean, so like suppose I don't have the concept of validity, so I don't know what valid means, but I could still believe the law of non-contradiction, couldn't I? All right. It seems like I could say my solution to the liar paradox without mentioning validity.
Well, I mean, okay. So, I mean, I just don't know what the solution would be. I mean, if you're just sort of saying, how do I get past this sort of puzzle that's weighing on me and on my mind, because I completely agree with you. You can do all sorts of things to get past that, satisfy your own, I don't mean you in particular, but one's own, yeah, it's sort of like you're hitting up against this problem and you need to move on, so you need a solution, and you go, yeah, lots of options. But I don't know how you can give a systematic, precise account of true theoretic paradoxes without talking about validity, both logical validity and, in particular, the extra logical validity relation that's supposed to govern vocabulary like truth, exemplification, etc. All the other semantic denotation, blah, blah, blah. I don't know how you could give a systematic, precise account of that stuff without talking about the validity relations. I mean, it's precisely the validity relations.
Yeah.
For example, your discussion of Curry's paradox, you know, I mean, you don't, in my opinion, you don't really discuss Curry's paradox. You just discuss a disjunctive liar, because you're just using the material conditional, which is logical vocabulary, but it's equivalent to logical negation and disjunction. And we already have those liars. Curry's paradox involves, non-material conditionals that, I mean, where it gets difficult, the paradox involves conditionals that go way beyond logical vocabulary, and trying to figure out which entailment patterns govern those conditionals is a very difficult thing. But it's pressing if you're going to resolve Curry in general. Maybe there isn't a general solution. Maybe it's piecemeal. My approach has always been to try to give, a really systematic, precise account of it. That's not the only thing that philosophy does, but that's sort of where I'm at when I do it.
I mean, when I started reading about the liar paradox, I realized that most of the literature about it was concerned with formal systems. I think my impression was that most people wanted to sort of, like they wanted to answer, well, how can we design a formal system so that it won't have this problem? I felt like that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I just wanted to understand the English sentence. This sentence is false, and like have an answer to somebody says, what's the truth value of that?
Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly fine project. I wouldn't characterize the work in fact, I wouldn't even characterize the majority of work on the liar and the sort of logical side of things as just trying to get a formal system. For example, collaborators and colleagues I've worked with, and the same with my own work, individual work, we wind up doing a lot with sort of formal stuff because it's so difficult to get clear on what the validity relations are governing the target vocabulary. But nobody cares about just sort of formal systems. Nobody works in formal systems. We're trying to fully describe a consequence relation, validity relation that governs the true theory of, these phenomena. And to do that, it's not like symbols and stuff are ultimately essential, but it's a lot easier to be clear, on, are we talking about this or are we talking about that? And nobody thinks that the English version of the liar, or, the many variations on it have symbols in it. Like, it's just, this is a way of getting clarity on an otherwise very murky and slippery subject.
Yeah. Could you just say, like, so you're trying to get a reason why we should think that validity is classical. Can you say what the classical account of validity is?
Yeah. Why we should think logical validity. The validity relation governing just the logical vocabulary is per the classical account. That's what I was asking. I would say any validity relation, any consequence relation that counts as a validity relation is an absence of counterexample relation, ultimately. And so focusing just on would-be logical validity, which is the validity relation governing just the logical vocabulary. And for example, by the way, the distinction just for viewers is, remember that logical vocabulary, or sorry, as far as logical validity goes, you know, it's necessarily true that P, therefore P is logically invalid. That's clearly logically invalid. Why? Because there's absolutely no logical validity, no logical vocabulary in that. So it gets seen by logical validity as P, therefore Q. But the true theory of necessity and all that, you add the target vocabulary. So we add a necessity connective. It's necessarily true that. And we assume logical validity on the bottom. But in that validity relation, we have this necessity connective, and that's going to have its own entailment patterns. And in the true account of necessity, the true theory of necessity, you're going to validate the pattern. Well, I mean, okay, if it's wrong, okay, we won't validate it. But let's assume that for the target notion of alethic modality necessity, we've got it's necessarily true that P entails P. Again, logical validity won't give you that, but the extra logical validity relation governing that vocabulary will. Okay. And so when you're giving an account of this stuff, you just, of these relations, you spell out the relevant vocabulary and you spell out the space of would-be counterexamples. Logical validity is going to have by far the biggest space. It governs only this sparse topic neutral vocabulary that rolls out very, very little. I mean, notice as far as logical validity goes, any sentence can be true as long as it doesn't have any logical vocabulary in it. The relation just doesn't care. It recognizes possibilities all over the place, crazy possibilities. But once you start narrowing the space of logical possibilities, you start to then constrain the space of would-be counterexamples, and that increases. So decrease the space of would-be counterexamples, and you increase the would-be valid patterns. So decrease. So on the I think logical validity is per FDE, which is basically. I mean, this isn't technically right, but just for this purposes now, it's basically sort of drop the principle that every sentence in the language is true or false, and no sentence both true and false. I'm using true and false here very technically and not explaining them, but you know what I mean. What you think I said is probably what I mean. And drop those and you get FDE. When you have those counterexamples, then you don't have the validity of that, and you don't have its dual, which is basically arbitrary B written the other way, but arbitrary B entails arbitrary A or not A. You drop those two things from the space, and from the classical, sorry, okay. Yeah, when you remove the gappy and glutty possibilities, you get classical back. And that's just the way you increase the validity relation. The number of valid patterns is by narrowing the space of counterexamples. So.
Okay. Okay, so I guess that the dispute is about whether certain rules are valid, like maybe whether disjunctive syllogism is valid.
Logically valid.
Yeah, and I get, I should know more about this, but I don't know. But I guess there are a few other rules that you would reject, you'd say are not valid.
Well, for example, excluded middle and its dual and that kind of stuff, and material modus ponens, material modus tollens, all these things are none of them are logically valid according to me.
Yeah.
Many of them are valid in many true theories. How did they get to be valid? Well, those theories, the consequence relation, the validity relation, the closure relation governing those true theories rule out the logical counterexamples, the logical possibilities that counterexample those patterns. These theories rule out those logical possibilities as theoretically impossible. Given the target phenomenon, these things are just impossible. This happens, in physics all the time. In any true theory, biology, mathematics, we roll out many logical possibilities because they're just not
Yeah.
possibilities given this phenomenon that we are truly and fully describing. Are they logical possibilities? Sure, but who cares?
Yeah. I think, one thing that I'm not totally clear about is, how we tell what counts as logical and not logical. And I'm not really sure why, it's necessary that isn't logical.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's a very important question. And I don't have a satisfying sort of how to put it. I don't know. Let me sort of contrast. So one sort of answer to that tries to define logical vocabulary very precisely mathematically. Tarski started this program long ago in terms of if all these sort of different recombinations and stuff can happen and you have this result, then it's logical, and otherwise you don't. Those never work. Although some people still, I shouldn't say they never will, but they haven't yet. My own view is, and the reason is you look at some of the standard vocabulary and you think that account doesn't get this standard first order stuff. Or if it does get all that, it gets this other stuff that it shouldn't. Like, how do you define it just sort of, mathematically? That's a hard and ongoing program that I'm not engaged in. I'm highly pessimistic that that's even possible, but I have no good reason for thinking it's impossible. My own view is this. If you look at controversies over the logical vocabulary, like, is that really logical? Including identity and other things, and modality. Think about Quine and others. Sometimes they drew the line just on extensional vocabulary. Personally, I do think all the logical is extensional, but not because there's something interestingly logical about extensional versus non-extensional. I just think it's sort of happens to be that way. If you want to identify the logical vocabulary, think about what the logical vocabulary is supposed to do. Why do we even care? Well, we care because the logical vocabulary, by all accounts, is supposed to be topic neutral, in the sense that it's in all true theories. No matter what the topic is, this vocabulary winds up in there. And so I think, the ultimate answer to what is the logical vocabulary, well, we wait until all the true theories are in at the end of, time, and or maybe beyond that. And and then we just look and see what's in the intersection of all those languages of those theories, and that's the logical vocabulary.
Well, do we know that there's anything in the intersection of all of them?
No, and in fact, some philosophers currently think that that the answer is null. This is one route towards what they call logical nihilism. My own view is, look at the history of these debates. People have normally landed on the standard first order vocabulary without identity. And the reason identity is really difficult is it doesn't just look like it is, it's sort of not topic neutral in the same way as conjunction and so on. But if you have identity, then you automatically get, well, at least on standard. I mean, you could debate. Maybe a better account is in the offing, but on standard accounts, you would get the logical validity of some x is identical to x. So you sort of get, as a logically valid thing, the existence of something. And that's kind of, so now ask about some necessity operators. Standard alethic, it's necessarily true that. Is that logical? Well, I have no really, clear, precise account of logical that rules it out. But my own view is it's clearly not in sort of like the true theory of arithmetic. So we know it's not in some theories, and it's probably not in the true theory of salamanders or something, and so on. So I just sort of think these things are not logical. To be logical, you have to basically be really, really like not saying much, and that's why we debate it, because the logical vocabulary is common in all true theories. So logical validity constrains all true theories. And that's why a debate over whether the account that allows both gaps and gluts, so we all agree on the truth and falsity conditions for the target logical vocabulary. They don't rule out gaps and gluts. The question is, should we? I don't see a good reason to do so. But I would love to hear one. I'm not putting the burden on you. I mean, I've a lot of
yeah.
Well,
it sort of seems maybe too basic to give a reason. Like, I mean, it's sort of like, I want to say, well, it's just like my understanding of what truth and falsity mean. I'm going to say something like truth and falsity are incompatible with each other. And, and falsity is just like the alternative to truth.
Yeah. I do think, by the way, that there's, I think there's a lot to clarify in what you just said, but I'm not going to, just given time. But let me just say this, that, again, bracketing out a bunch of things that that could be clarified. So I think that your sort of response there, or your thought there, is common. Again, lots of things to ask about what it really means, but so when you see something like The Liar or something, right? It says, okay, I don't mean to be question begging against you. You've already said, you hold classical logic and then try to make sense of this, but forget your official view, right? I'm just going to put The Liar the way you put it. It's a standard way of doing it. So you have this view of, well, truth and falsity are incompatible. I think a lot of people, including undergraduates who take their first sort of logic class or something like that, and they say, yeah, these are incompatible. They'll all agree, unless they're just trying to be cool or something. But many of them, they'll say that, and then you say, well, what about a sentence like, you write on the board, right? The sentence on the board in room whatever is false. And I mean, they haven't been told what's supposed to be logically valid and what isn't. And I mean, the response, I'm not putting evidential weight on this. I'm just saying sort of the natural thought is, yeah, okay. When I said that you can never be true and false, I was just sort of speaking on a maybe an inadequate diet of examples. It's like the old I heard this story about Feynman once, and I don't know much about Feynman, and I certainly am no expert on his work in physics, but there was some story about him responding to a teacher who said, there's two sides to everything, and then he cut a strip of paper and made a Mobius strip, and he said, well, find the other side. I sort of just have a similar reaction. Now, if you want to dig your heels in and say, well, I know, it's the 11th commandment that there are two sides to everything. And again, this wasn't a claim about physical reality, so I'd say the same. Don't you find it like a not unnatural thought that what you're saying, the very meaning of truth and falsity, and again, there's real questions for later, not today, but the very meaning sort of says that they're incompatible. But then you sort of confront these weird, okay, well, for the most part, they wind up, keeping each other out. But there are these sort of, weird things that maybe they overlap. I'm not saying the very existence of this thing proves. I'm obviously not saying that. Yeah. I'm just saying, as a basic thought, anyway, I suppose the point's across.
No, yeah, that's good. Yeah. I mean, for ordinary people, if you wanted to motivate the idea of truth value gluts, give them the liar sentence, and then it looks like there's a super compelling argument that it's both true and false. Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. True. Graham Priest, so he obviously very famous and incredibly productive glut theorist. He actually thinks that I've always thought, when I first encountered The Liar, I was like, I knew a little bit about relevance logic and stuff. And so it was very natural. I just thought, hey, this automatically, like, wow. And Priest told me, he said he has never thought that that's the strongest argument. And I was really surprised. He thinks that the strongest argument comes from legal contexts where, okay, you can vote on this so long as you have a purple shirt on, right? You can vote on this issue. You're not allowed to vote on this if you've ever lived in Colorado, and so on, right? And these bodies of law, right? He's right, as a matter of fact, that bodies of law are often like that. They get written in weird ways by different parties, different political climates, this and that. And they wind up delivering, inconsistent laws. So it's both true that that one person, and true and false, that the person can vote.
Yeah.
And I myself, I mean, I've written why I think that that's not a strong argument, but he still believes that it is. But I just wanted to point out, I'm with you. I think that the liar is a really easy one. I mean, to me, none of these things are absolutely, if we had proofs from the very bottom, things would be easy, but we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no. So I get my answer to the liar sentence, but you'd mentioned this example where somebody writes on the board the sentence in whatever room 101 is false, and you don't know what's in room 101. Then somebody asks you, so this would be a problem from my view. Somebody asks you, does that express a proposition? And then so then what I have to say is I don't know until I see what's in room 101. And then I will know whether this expresses a proposition. But that does seem kind of wrong, because it seems like I understand the thing on this blackboard before going to the other room. It's like, it seemed, I don't know, you could say I can describe some conditions under which this would count as true, so it looks like I understand it. And I don't I'm still puzzled by that. I don't have a great answer to that.
Yeah. Well, there's also, I mean, again, I think, if you're going to, commit to the classical account of logical validity, I think that something like this, you're gonna wind up somewhere in this vicinity. And that problem, together with, there's an old example Kripke was pointing out with problems of with the Tarskian account of like truth, and how that, so in some ways, by the way, the standard Tarskian account is a no proposition view, right? Because, okay, for your viewers, the Tarskian account says that no language has a truth predicate both in the language and for the language. But you have many languages that contain truth predicates for a different language. And in his defense, Tarski didn't think he was giving an account of truth in English at all. He was just trying to set up how you could do this in sort of particular, generally like mathematical theories and stuff. But and Kripke pointed out that he said, look, this just, first off, you'd never know whether you can, apply the term true, because you'd have to go through the whole language of like what you're applying it to figure it out, something like this. And he said, but forget about that. He said, just think about how easily these liar-like sentences seem to appear, because you can name something. So, the grammar kicks out the sentence, G is false, right? Counts that in English, that would let G be a name. So actually, he said Bob is false. He said, this counts as a sentence. It's a singular term and a unary predicate. And he said, now take identity, and Bob equals Bob is false. You have a name of the sentence that the grammar kicks out, namely Bob is false, and you dub that very sentence Bob. by using identity in the way that we name things right and left. And he said, you know, to reject that we can create these things. And now I know your response would have to be, well, you can't create a proposition, so you know you have to something like that. But his point was ultimately, you know, it's not that there aren't classically constrained ways of responding. His response was, you know, the classical logician is trying to save appearances of classical logic, and I'm not sure how strong those appearances are, as we've discussed, but it's trying to save those appearances at the cost of giving up even stronger appearances, like the ease with which we can name sentences and that sort of stuff. And your board in the other room example is a similar sort of thing, though that strikes me as more epistemic. The Kripke thing is a sort of more about what we're in control of doing, I guess. But yeah. Gabriel, have we answered all your questions?
Yeah, I enjoyed the discussion. I guess we can end it here. So I'd like to thank Professor Huemer and Professor Beall for coming on. It was really great having you both on the show.
Thanks for having me. And
yeah, thanks for having me as well. Okay, take care.
You too.